All right, to both say good morning or good night. Let's begin. So first of all, our shir sponsored this month by Paul and Kathy Pollack in memory of Solomon Floret Pollack, Sarah Bas Avram, Shmuel ben Zechariah. May the Neshamas have an aliyah, the family, and the Chama. We thank the Pollack Mishpacha for their sponsorship. And also by the Wilner family in commemoration of the yard site of Sarah Shendel Bas Binyamin Halevi, a.k.a. Grandma, whose yard site was this past week. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah and Neshama will have an aliyah and the family in the Chama. So with that, let's begin. A lot to do today. Today's daf is daf Hey 5. We are picking up on Dalid Amud Beis by the Mishnah, the second class Mishnah on the daf. 2, 4, 6 lines up from the bottom. So hopefully by now, you're mamish getting into Maseches Horayos. You see the incredible beauty of it, the incredible intensity of it, a little bit of a different kind of limud. Thank you so much, Steve. Than what we're normally used to, but something very exciting nevertheless. It says the Mishnah, Horu Bezdin Shogigin. Va'asu Kolakal Shogigin. If Bezdin made a mistaken, erroneous ruling, and Klal Yisrael acted upon this ruling, B'shogeg as well. In other words, Klal Yisrael did not realize that ultimately something was wrong. They had done something wrong. Mavi'in par. So ultimately, again, they bring the par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. This is a special carbon that's brought when Klal Yisrael unintentionally follows an erroneous ruling of Bezdin. Mezidin va'asur shogigin. What happens if Bezdin purposely gave an erroneous ruling, but Klal Yisrael again were shogin? In other words, Klal Yisrael didn't realize that the ruling was incorrect. So the halacha is mevi'in kispa usira. So we'll see this. What this essentially means is that the kispa usira is another way of saying a personal chatos. So in this case, I will say where the intention, the erroneous ruling of Bezdin was intentional, Klal Yisrael was shogig. So in that case, there's no par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. There's just personal liability through a regular chatos. Shogigin va'asum azidin hara'elu p'turin. If the Bezdin was shogeg, but the people knew Bezdin was wrong, but they still intentionally violated, then the halacha is pater, then there's no carbon. So also there's no par ha'elam davar min hatzibur, because as we'll see, par ha'elam davar min hatzibur is only when everyone is shogeg. That's number one. And of course, there's no personal liability, there's no chatos, because chatas is also only brought in the case of shogeg, and in this case, Klal Yisrael were mezidin. So the Gemara goes weiter. Shogegin va'asu mezidin hara'elu p'turin. So we can infer from the Mishnah as follows: that if Bezdin delivered their ruling b'shogeg, but Klal Yisrael went ahead and acted b'mezid, hara'elu p'turin. Ultimately, again, they are pater. They are pater. No par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. Ha-shogeg dumya demezid chayiv. We can infer from this that if it was shogeg dumya demezid, that if it was, what does that mean? That it's chayiv. What's the case of shogeg dumya demezid? Ve'echidami shahoru Bezdin shechelev mutar. So Bezdin, we also had this case earlier. Bezdin paskind mistakenly that chelev was mutar. Finis chalif lo b'shuman, and then I will say what happens. I have a piece of chelev and a piece of shuman. My chelev and my shuman, which remember shuman is permitted fat, chelev is prohibited fat, gets mixed up. Va'achlo, and I end up eating chelev. But remember again, my intention wasn't to eat chelev. What was my intention to do? My intention was to eat shuman. But yet I ended up eating the chelev. So we'll say, what's talach? So the Gemara says, lema, I'm sorry. So we'll say that would be a case of shogeg dumya demezid, which sounds like, based on what the Mishnah said, that should be a case of where I should be covered ultimately again in my liability by the psak of the Bezdin. To which the Gemara says, if that's the case, tif shota debayrai barchama. But yet again, if that's the case that it could be inferred from the Mishnah, yet why does Rami Bar Chama ask that very question earlier? Amar lo chamishum detana reisha mezidin va'asu shogegin tanu seifa shogegin va'asu mezidin. Which the Gemara answers, no, don't infer anything from this lashon. Rather, again, what the Mishnah was just aiming for was Mishnaic symmetry. Since the beginning of the Mishnah began by saying shogeg, since the beginning said mezidin va'asu shogegin, therefore the Seifa just wrote shogegin va'asu mezidin. But we'll say the takeaway from this Mishnah is that in order to be chayiv in a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur, in order to be chayiv ultimately for this specific type of carbon, it has to be shogegin on the part of Bezdin and shogeg on the part of Klal Yisrael. Bezdin must be mistaken, must be shogeg in their delivery of an erroneous ruling, and Klal Yisrael must be shogeg in their reliance on Bezdin. If everybody is shogeg, then ultimately, again, we can bring the par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. Says the Mishnah, Horu Bezdin, Vasu Kalakal or Ruban al PM. Let's say so Bezdin delivers their erroneous psak, and what happens? All of Klal Yisrael, or for that matter, a majority of Klal Yisrael, acts on the psak. So we'll say, what's that? Mevian par. So we bring a par halam davin atzibur. So here we're adding another qualification. So qualification number one is that the Bezdin has to be b'shogeg, Klal Yisrael has to be b'shogeg. Next qualification I will say is that there must be either kol hakal, which we'll discuss what that means, or ruban, either the entire Klal Yisrael or the majority of Klal Yisrael has to act based on the mistaken ruling of Bezdin. If that happens, we'll say they bring a par. If it happens to be that the mistaken ruling was regarding Avodah Zarah, then Ubavodas Kochav Mevian par v'soyer. So ultimately, again, we'll say for Avodah Zarah, there's not just the par, but there's an additional soyer as well. These are Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda says something very interesting. He says Yud Beis Shvatim Mevian Yud Beis Parim. But we'll say he says the following: that ultimately, again, if we're talking about a situation where all of the Shvatim sinned, so every single Shevet brings their own par. So again, I will say, same case. Ultimately, again, Beis Din delivered an erroneous ruling. The tribes act, Klal Yisrael acts on that ruling. Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says that each Shevet must bring their own par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. Uba'avodas kochavim, mevi'in yud beis parim u'shneim asar sirim. And again, if the mistake was with Avodah Zarah, then each Shevet must bring its own par as well as its own seer for 12 parim and 12 seerim. Rabbi Shimon says yud gimel parim uba'avodas kochavim shlosha asar parim. So let's listen to this. Yud gimel seerim. Par v'sar l'chol shevet u'shevet, par v'sar lebezdin. Rabbi Shimon has an interesting sheet. Rabbi Yehuda builds on Rabbi Yehuda, and he says that I will say the halacha is that for par halam davar min hatzibur, each shevet brings their own, and what? Bezdin also brings one. So for example, I will say in a normal case, quote unquote normal case, so there would be 13 parim, one for each tribe, and Bezdin would bring their own. If it was Avodah Zarah, it would be 13 parim and 13 seirim. So the Gemara says, Horu Bezdin va'asu zayin shvatim o ruban. What happens if Bezdin administers an erroneous ruling? And 7 tribes. So also we mentioned this yesterday. 7 shvatim, O Ruban al Pien. So we'll say, or for that matter, the majority of Klal Yisrael. And we'll say now, in this case, remember again, we're talking about 2 different things over here. There is either a tribal majority or a numerical majority. Tribal majority is when 7 of the tribes go ahead and follow the erroneous ruling. Or the Gemara says, O Ruban, or the numerical majority of Klal Yisrael, even if it's less than 7 tribes. So the halacha is mevi'in par. Uba'avodas kochav mevi'in par v'sar de Remeir. So also Remeir says that halacha l'maisa, as long as you have either a tribal majority or a numerical majority of Klal Yisrael following the erroneous ruling of Beis Din, that triggers the par ha'elam davar min hatzibur issue. Rabbi Yehuda says as follows: Rabbi Yehuda Omer, zayin shvatim shechatu mevi'in zayin parim. Rabbi Yehuda says, if 7 of the tribes sinned, then each tribe brings its own par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. So this is Rabbi Yehuda l'shitaso. Rabbi Yehuda always holds that each tribe, each shevet, brings its own par. Furthermore, he says something amazing. He says, Ushar shvatim shalochatu. What about the other tribes who didn't do anything wrong? Mevi'in al yedehen par. Ultimately, again, I will say, the tribes who didn't sin bring a par for the tribes who did sin. Why? He says, the Gemara says, Sha'af elu shalochatu mevi'in al yedei chotin. Because ultimately, again, even the tribes who did not sin bring a par on behalf of those tribes who did sin. Rabbi Shimon says, Ches parim, uba'avodas kochavim, ches parim, v'ches seirim, par v'sar l'chol shevet, v'shevet, par v'sar l'beizin. Rabbi Shimon says, no, only the tribes who sinned go ahead and bring a karban. But Rabbi Shimon, as in his what Rabbi saying, is that Beis Din brings its own karban. So each tribe will bring its karban, Beis Din will bring its own additional karban. Horu Beis Din shal echa min hashvatim va'asa osa shevet apien. Well, this is actually very interesting. What happens if the high court of one of the shvatim, each of the shvatim also have their own courts. Let's say one of the high courts of one of the shvatim paskined erroneously, delivered a wrongful psak, and that shevet acted on that psak. What's the halacha? Oso shevet hu chayiv, Ushar kol hashvatim p'turim de Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda also will say that shevet who followed its Beis Din is chayiv for a par, but the other shvatim are pater. Ve'acham the chachamim say no, ein chayavin ella al horoya ella al Horayos. So here you go, the name of the Masechta. Horayos Beis Din Agadol. So we'll say the chachamim say no. Par ha'elam davar min hatzibur, we'll say, is only brought if there is one Beis Din who delivers an erroneous ruling. And which Beis Din is that? That's the High Court, the Sanhedrin. Shene amar v'im kol adas Yisrael yishku v'lo adas also shevet. So I'll say, interesting enough, the way the Chacham understand this, adas Yisrael is actually a reference to the Sanhedrin, as we're going to see. So the Chacham disagree, and the Chacham say that if a tribal court goes ahead and delivers an erroneous ruling, there is no liability for par ha'elam davar min hatzibur, only if the Sanhedrin issues an erroneous ruling. Tan Rabbanan. So we'll say, we now have a fundamental three of machlokes in the Mishnah. We're going to analyze this now. So Tan Rabbanan. Yadu shahoru v'tou mahoru. So let's listen to this case. Let's say Beis Din realized that they had issued an erroneous ruling, but what? They didn't realize, or they don't remember what the wrong psak was. If you look at the first Rashi in the Gemara, Rashi says, Yadu shahoru v'tou ma shahoru, kilomar haru Beis Din shechelev muter b'bittul miktzas, v'asu kalapiem v'achlu shogigin chelev v'dam, davichad b'shigagas maisa, bilvad v'chad b'hora, v'achar kach yadu shahoru shelo karoi, ela shetav ma shahoru de'inim yodim im ala chelev horu o ala dam. So let's listen to this case. Beis Din realized that they made an erroneous ruling. They just forgot what the erroneous ruling was. So they know either we permitted chelev or dam. We just can't remember which one. In the interim, what happens? Klal Yisrael consumed both of these things. So the Shara says, what do you do in this kind of case? So Yachol yu chayavin, you might have thought that there'd be a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur tamid lomar v'noda hachatas. So the pasuk says that the sin became known. V'lo sheyodu achotin. It's not just enough to know that the people sinned, but rather again for a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur, what does there have to be? There has to be a specific knowledge as to what the erroneous psak actually was. Asher chatu. So both say that, and that indeed is halacha l'maisa. In order to trigger a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur liability, there has to be clarity as to what the wrong psak was. If Beis Din says, listen, we know we delivered a wrong psak, but what? We don't know what the psak was, then that cannot trigger a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur liability. Asher chatu shnei shvatim mevi'en shnei parim. If two tribes went ahead and sinned, so we'll say they bring two parim, shlosha, mevi'in shlosha. So we'll say, or if three tribes made a mistake, so ultimately again they bring three parim. Oh, eino omer ela chatu shnei yechidim mevi'in shnei parim, chatu gimel mevi'in gimel. Or a matter of fact, maybe even if it's not tribes, but maybe ultimately again, if an individual makes a mistake, he also brings the par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. Therefore, again, the pasuk says, Talmud lomar hakal chayiv v'chol kal. So Gemara says v'chol kal v'kal chayiv. But so therefore, the pasuk says it is only the kal who brings a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur, never min hayochid. But what does it mean v'chol kal v'kal chayiv? Ketzad chatu shnei shvatim mevi'in shnei parim, chatu zayin mevi'in zayin. Usharsh, so we'll say, therefore, again, what do we learn from this? If two tribes sinned, each of those tribes brings a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. Similarly, if 7 tribes sinned, so 7 tribes bring a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. And furthermore, ushar shvatim shalochatu mevi'in al yedehen par. So I'll say, ultimately, again, and even the tribes who did not sin, bring a par on behalf of the tribes who did sin. Shafilu elu shalochatu mevi'in al yedei achotin. Lekach ne'emar kal, lechayiv al kol kahal v'kal divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say, this is the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. The Rabbi Yehuda shita, we'll say, is twofold. Number one, that there is individual tribal liability, that if a particular shevet goes ahead and commits or follows the erroneous psak or the Beis Din, that shevet brings a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. They both say, Rabbi Yehuda's shita is that calls shevet v'shevet ikri kahal. He holds, remember again, the operative word by par helam davar minat tzibor is kahal. Torah says there is only liability when the kahal follows an erroneous psak of Beis Din. The machlokas is going to be what? How do you define kahal? Rabbi Yehuda defines kahal as a shevet. So if an individual shevet follows an erroneous psak of Beis Din, in Shitas Rabbi Yehuda, they have to bring a par helam davar minat tzibor. That's part one. But not only that, even the tribes who did not sin bring a par helam davar minat tzibor for what? For the tribes who did. For the tribes who did. That's Rabbi Yehuda's shita. That ultimately, so therefore again, the Gemara says, L'chayiv al kol kal v'kal div Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda ultimately holds that halocha l'maisa again, the tribes who sinned, go ahead and what? Bring a par halam davar minat tzibor, and the tribes who did not sin, bring a par for the tribes who did sin.
Altogether one, or
each shevet?
So there's always 12.
There's always 12. There's always 12. So Rabbi Shimon says, Zayin shvatim shechatu. So listen to this. Mevi'in zayin parim, ubeizim mevi'in al yidei par. Shene'emar lemata kal, v'ne'emar lemala kal. Ma kala amr lemala Beis Din makal. Af kala amr lemata Beis Din makal. So what Rabbi Shimon says a little bit differently. Rabbi Shimon agrees with Rabbi Yehuda in that what? In that when an individual shevet sins, so that shevet brings a par helam davar minat tzibor. But he adds in one thing and he disagrees on one thing. He adds in that when a shevet brings a par, who else brings a par? I will say the Beis Din. The Beis Din. What he disagrees with is where in Rabbi Yehuda's model, the non-sinning shvatim will also bring a par on behalf of the shvatim who did sin, but yet Lamais again Rabbi Shimon disagrees with that. So what's in Rabbi Shimon's model? The shvatim who committed the avera, who inadvertently relied on an erroneous psak of the Beis Din, so they will bring a par, plus the Beis Din who delivered the erroneous psak will also bring a par. That's the sheet of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Meir says, Zayin shvatim shechatu Beis Din mevin al yedei par vein peturin. And I will say lastly is the sheet of Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa, it is only the Beis Din who brings the par helam davar minat tzibor, never the shevet. The shvatim don't bring the par. Only, say Rabbi Meir says, Zayin shvatim shechatu. About saying in Rabbi Meir's model, the only time you bring a par helam davar minat tzibor is when there's a majority of the kal, the majority of Klal Yisrael. So again, how we define majority, we see two possibilities: either 7 tribes, or the numerical majority of the kal. Either way, Rabbi Meir says is that Allah Chamaisa, when there is a majority who has sinned, it is only Beis Din who brings the par helam davar minat tzibor, not the shvatim. Not the shvatim. Ne'emar kal lamata, v'ne'emar kal lamala. Ma kal ha'amar lamala Beis Din v'lo tzibor, af kal ha'amar lamata Beis Din v'lo tzibor. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, Mishmo. So we'll say, what does he say? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar holds, Chatu shisha shvatim, vein rubo shalkal. If 6 of the tribes sinned, and they represent the majority of Klal Yisrael, O Zayin, or 7 tribes sinned, Afapi she'inu rubo shalkal, even though what? They are not the majority of the kal. Nevertheless, mevi'in par. So we'll say Shimon ben Elazar comes along and says, we'll say he's coming to define what is majority. So he says majority could take on one of 2 forms: either 7 tribes, even if they're not the numerical majority, or numerical majority, even if it's not 7 of the tribes. So we'll say first wide line. Amar Mar, v'noda chatas v'lo sheyadu achotin. We'll say furthermore again, what did we say in the Bryce above? That the only time you bring a par helam davar minat tzibor is when the Beis Din is explicitly clear as to what? As to the erroneous ruling they delivered. In other words, if Beis Din is unsure about the erroneous ruling, Beis Din knows, we know we did something wrong, we just what? We don't know what. You don't bring a par helam davar minat tzibor. V'lo sheyadu achotin. Mantana, we'll say, who is the opinion who says this? Who is the opinion who says this? So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rabbi Tema Rava, Delo Rabbi Eliezer. So we'll say, before we get to who we know it's like, we can tell you who it's not like. It's not like Rabbi Eliezer. This nan, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Manafshach, Im Chelev Achal, Chayiv, Nosra Achal Chayiv. So we'll say, Rabbi Eliezer is commenting actually in a different case. Rashi points out he's talking about in a case of in Meseches Krisus, where a person is not sure, there's an individual. I'm not sure if I ate chelev, or I'm not sure if I ate nosar. So Rabbi Eliezer says at the end of the day, I can go ahead and bring a chatas. Why? Because it was like the carbon for eating chelev or for eating nosar is the same. It's a chatas. So Rabbi Eliezer says, who cares whether you know you ate chelev, you ate chatas, as long as you know what? You ate something, right? You ate one of those items, then I could bring a chatas, because at the end of the day, it's the same liability for both. That's Rabbi Eliezer. So we'll say, Rashi points out over here, that halacha l'maaseh Rabbi Yeshua says you're potter. Rabbi Yeshua says that at the end of the day, if you don't know the exact nature of your liability, then you are not chayiv. So our Mishnah will say clearly, or the Brisa doesn't reflect the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Because if it was Rabbi Eliezer, even if the Beis Din doesn't know what the erroneous ruling was, Rabbi say, as long as we know what? As long as we know that they permitted something whose intentional consumption would what? Would be chayiv kares. As long as we know they did that, then what does it matter if it was chelev, if it was this, doesn't make a difference. So obviously our Gemara, our Brisa does not reflect the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Rav Ashi says, Afilutim Rabbi Eliezer, no, it could be even Rabbi Eliezer. Why? Shani Yachad Yichsev, could be Par Helam David Minatzi, where it's a little bit different. Why? Because the pasuk says, Asher Chata Aleha. Because we'll say the pasuk says, that Beis Din is chayiv for, or I should say, that Par Helam David Minatzibor is, that Par Helam David Minatzibor is triggered when Klal Yisrael does something asher chatu aleha. So we'll say, so there's a specificity articulated in the pasuk. Asher chatu aleha, for the specific sin that they committed upon it. I hasam nami haksiv. But one second. Hasam nami haksiv. Asher chatu aleha. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. Hasam nami haksiv asher chata ba. Bless you. Homi bayile prat lemisaseg. I will say there that pasuk is coming to teach us something else, which is what? That one cannot be chayiv a chayiv achatos if they are misasek. I will say misasek means that I was involved in a totally different activity that inadvertently resulted in the commission of an avera. In that case, everyone that's misasek, everyone will agree that halacha l'maisa again, I am not chayiv a chatos in that case. My time is Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say, so now we're going back. So now what we have over here is the various shitos concerning under what circumstances ultimately again is a par helam davar min hatzibor bra. So remember again, shitas Rabbi Yehuda is that the 12 shvatim, each of the shvatim brings their own par. None of that, what does Rabbi Yehuda say? What does Rabbi Yehuda say? That even the shvatim who didn't sin bring on behalf of the shvatim who did sin. What's Rabbi Yehuda's shita? My time, Rabbi Yehuda. Kasavar arba kahalik sivi. Rabbi Yehuda says the word kal in some form appears 4 times throughout the parsha of Par Helam Davar min hatzibor. Right? He says kahal, hakahal, kahal, hakahal. So we'll say, what do I use these 4 kals for? Chad lechayv kol kal v'kal. One is a teaching that's what? That each and every shevet is chayiv. That each and every shevet is called a kal. It's called an assembly unto itself. That's one kal. V'chad lohorot liba beis u'maisa taloi bekal. We'll say the second one teaches me that Par Helam Tzibim is only when it brought when the Beis Din administers the ruling, and it's the Tzibor who acts on the ruling. V'chad legrira. We'll say one is teaching me about grira. What's grira? We'll say that halacha l'maisa, even the shvatim who didn't sin bring grira. Literally means dragged along. Bring a carbon on behalf of the shvatim who did sin. V'chad l'shevet sha'asa b'Horayos Beis Din. And we'll say ultimately again, one is to teach me about the fact that if I will say, if you look at Rashi, says v'chad l'shevet sha'asa b'Horayos Beis Din k'distam b'seifa d'maslisin horu Beis Din sha'ach min hashvatim. There was according to Rabbi Yehuda, even if one of the shvatim acted based on the psak halacha of its own Beis Din, that's Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda learns out all of his shitos from the 4 times the fact that the word kal is written. Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Shimon's model, talasa kalik sivi, it says the word kal 3 times, hakahal, kal, hakahal. Meineakahal orche dekro. But he doesn't touch on the 4th kal. Why? Because that 4th kal appears in the phrase me'ene hakahal. It was obscured from the eyes of the kal, which means again, Beis Din made a mistake. He says that one you can't darshan. Why? Because that's just an expression. Kedamri inshi me'ene deplanya. As we'll say, people often say, the matter was hidden from the eyes of so-and-so. So we'll say, how does he pass? So one kal comes to teach me that each shevet has its own liability for following the psak of the Beis Din. Utrei achrini ne'amar lemata kal v'ne'amar lemala kal. It says kal earlier and it says kal over here. Malahalan bezin makal. Just like we'll say, it says over here that bezin has to be with the kal. Afkan bezin makal. So to we'll say over here we're only chayiv if what? If it's the high court that ultimately goes ahead and administers the psak halacha. Rabbi Meir, kal hakal lo darsh. Rabbi Meir doesn't darshan this at all. He doesn't darshan kals. Therefore, therefore, ultimately, again, he needs the two kals that are written. Why? Nemar lemata kal v'nemar lemala kal. Ma lahalon bezdin v'lo tzibor. Afkan bezdin v'lo tzibor. We'll say he teaches it to me to teach me what? That just like earlier, again, I will say the kal is referring to bezdin, not the tzibor. So to over here is referring to bezdin, not the tzibor. So I will say, remember again, what's Rabbi Meir's shita? Rabbi Meir's shita ultimately is that who brings the par helam davar min tzibor? It's the bezdin. It's the Beis Din. Beis Din brings the power, not the populace. Therefore, he learns that out ultimately again from the Gzeir Shabbat. Rav Shimon Elazar, my taimo. What's Rav Shimon Elazar's logic? Ksiv v'haya me'inei ha'ida alma mi'uta d'chsiv me'inei. So we'll say again, remember on one hand, Rav Shimon Elazar says as follows. The pasuk says v'haya me'inei ha'ida. Now he understands me'inei ha'ida to be a limiting or exclusionary phrase. So the Gemara says, and ksiv, and it says, kilochala am bishkaga lememra deruban in miutalo. So we'll say on one hand it says me'inei ha'eda if a matter becomes obscured from the eyes of the congregation. So it sounds like again even if a small minority sinned, yet it also says kilochala am bishkaga. Chala also means what? Everyone sinned. So which one is it? Lememra deruba in miutalo sounds like it's only the rov but not the miut. So in other words haketzad. Asuvav vehin ruban shalkal. So I'll say Rabbi Shmuel says teaches me the following: if 6 of the tribes committed the avera, meaning acted based on the erroneous psak of the Sanhedrin, and they represent the numerical majority of Klal Yisrael, afa pishen rubo, or ozayin afa pishen rubo shalkal, or if 7 of the tribes followed the erroneous psak of the basin, even though what they are not the numerical majority, nevertheless chayav, and ultimately again they are chayiv. We'll say on the days. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Meir, Dahora Tliya Bebezdin, Umaisa Tliya Bekalminal. They will say, where did Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Meir know that in order for a par halam tzibur obligation to be triggered, the psak halacha has to be given by the Bezdin, but the action has to be taken by the kahal, to which the Gemara says, where do we know that? From Minalahu, Amar Abaye, Da Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, V'haya ime'ene ha'eda nesta lishkaga. Because we'll say the pasuk says, and it will be if from the eyes of the congregation nesta lishkaga, the matter was committed inadvertently. Rava Amar Rava says, Milachala am bishkaga. Rava learned from the pasuk from the Chala am bishkaga that the entire nation acted inadvertently. Utzricha, we need both pasukim. Why? Because of Rachman Levaya Amenea Eda Nesta Lishkaga. For what it just said, the first pasuk, Sahava Amina Afilu Miuta. I would have thought that even if just the minority of the population sins, there's a par helam davar min hatzibor. Therefore, the pasuk says that the entire nation is inadvertent. Ikas of am bishkaga, and if it would have just said am bishkaga, hava amina ada avdi bezdin bahadi ruba. I might have thought that halacha l'maisa, the Beis Din, has to act together with this Rav as well. But once again, these psukim are also written in the context of Avodah Zarah. So ultimately, we make Gzeir Shabbat of Eine to teach us that this halacha applies whether Beis Din is delivering an erroneous ruling about Avodah Zarah or about anything else for which there would be a chiyuv kares. Good, weiter. Horu Beis Din shal echad. So let's remember again, what did the Mishnah say? If the Beis Din of one of the tribes, delivered an erroneous ruling, so we'll say again, that does not trigger par ha'elam davar min hatzibur. Has to be the Sanhedrin. So it says the Gemara, Ibaylahu, Shevet echad Rabbi Yehuda, Ba'oraz Beis Din agadol, mi maisu, shar shvatim olo. Also listen to this question. What happens if you have the following situation? Horaz Beis Din agadol, Shevet Echad Rabbi Yehuda. But so we'll say, what happens if one tribe acted based on the psak of the Sanhedrin Agadol? So we'll say, so one tribe acted, but it was the psak of the Sanhedrin Agadol. So we'll remember again, what does Rabbi Yehuda hold? Rabbi Yehuda holds that each and every tribe brings its own par helam davar min hatzibor. So what happens in the following situation? One tribe acts based on the erroneous psak of the Beis Din Hagadol. Mi maisu shar shvatim olo. So let's remember again Rabbi Yehuda's model. Remember also the tribes who did not commit an avera also what? Bring on behalf of the tribes that did. So if one tribe committed an avera based on the psak of the Sanhedrin Hagadol, do the other tribes bring for that one tribe or not? Mi aminon shiva shatim hu demaisu shar shvatim bahadayu mishum deikaruba. Do we say the only time that the other tribes bring a carbon abosa is when you have 7 tribes? When you have the majority of the tribes who committed an inadvertent sin based on the sack of the Beis Din, that's when we say that what? That the tribes who didn't sin have to bring on behalf of the tribes who did sin. However, again, but again, one tribe, now remember also in Rabbi Yehuda's model, even if one tribe sins, remember Rabbi Yehuda's whole model is, one tribe is also called a kal. So Rabbi Yehuda's model, you can have, if one tribe follows the psak of the Sanhedrin Hagadol, an erroneous psak, they are going to bring a par helam davra minat tzibor. That will happen. The shaila is, do the other tribes have to also bring on behalf of that one tribe? Remember Said said before that Rabbi Yehuda's model, you always have 12. So, not necessarily, meaning remember, here's what we do know. We know when there is a majority of the tribes, then what? Then all 12 bring. Now the Gemara is asking is, what happens if one tribe sins? So we'll say, what do we know in Rabbi Yehuda's model when one tribe sins? That tribe, one tribe is called a kal, that tribe brings a par helam davar min hatzibor. That we know. That's whether that's halacha ma'is, we'll have to see. But that's Rabbi Yehuda. The shaila, do all the other tribes bring on behalf of the one as well? So do we say the only time that the rest of the tribes bring is when there's a rove of the shvatim who sinned? Then even the ones who didn't bring, avachat shevet deleka rubalo. But if there's only one tribe, obviously is not a rove, then the other tribes do not bring. Or maybe not. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda's model essentially is one for all, right? One for all and all for one. That once one of the shvatim is bringing a par helam davar min hatzibor, by definition, that ignites tribal liability for all of the shvatim. Suppose say that's the shaila. Say thank you. I'm shaking a special bracha on the Pesach coffee this year. Delicious. Says the Gemara Tashma. Mahin Mivian. So let's listen to this. So what do they bring? Par echad. What do the tribes bring? So par echad, they bring one par. Rabbi Shimon says, I should say differently. The Mishnah says, Mahin Mivian. What do they bring? Par echad, one par. Rabbi Shimon Amar Shnei parim. Rabbi Shimon says 2 parim. So what's the case here? If you want to say that it's where 7 tribes sinned, Rabbi Shimon tamniei bai. So we'll say in that case, Rabbi Shimon. Remember what shittas Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon says that not only do the shvatim bring their own parim, but what else? Beis Din also brings. So if we're talking about a case where 7 of the tribes sinned, so in Rabbi Shimon's model there should be 8 parim, 7 for the tribes, 1 for Beis Din. Rather, it must be what? We must be talking about a case over here where one shevet sinned. So what's the case? B'mai, Ibahoras Beis Dino, if the shevet made a mistake in that it relied on its own Beis Din, Rabbi Shimon Lesley, right? So we'll say if that's the case, remember again, if they're relying on if the mistake we're talking about is a mistaken ruling given by their own Beis Din, then what? Then Rabbi Shimon will say there is no par ha'elam davar min hatzibor in that case. Elalav B'horaz Beis Din Hagadol. Rather, it has to be what? That it's talking about an erroneous ruling of the Sanhedrin Hagadol. V'tanakama mai money. And Rabbi say, who's the pain is the Tanakama? Inim Rabbi Meir Haru Babai. But say if you want to say it's Rabbi Meir requires the majority of the shvatim for param davar min hatzibor. Elalav Rabbi Yehuda. Rather, you have to say it's Rabbi Yehuda. Ukigon shechata shevet echad. And what's the case? The case is where one shevet sinned. So we'll say, therefore, what do you see from that? It sounds like that according to Rabbi Yehuda, where one shevet sins, who brings the par halam davar min hatzibor? That's one shevet, and the other shvatim are not activated in a situation like that. What's the case over here? Kegon shechatu shisha shvatim vein ruban shalkal. But say, no, what's the case over here? Is where 6 of the tribes, six of the shvatim sinned, but they are in the numerical majority. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, and Rabbi said, effectively Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, say the Sanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, We'll say first white line. Mishmo, I'm sorry, Rabbi Shmuel Silber on Mishmo. Chatu Shisha, Vein Ruban Shalkal. If 6 of the Shvatim sinned, and they are the numerical majority, O Shiva Afa Pi She'enan Ruban Shalkal, or 7 sinned. Right, they're the tribal majority, even though they're not the numerical majority. Mevi and par. But say the halach is they bring a par. So the Gemara says, Tashma, Rabbi Huda Omer. Rabbi Huda says as follows: Shevet sha'asa b'horaz bezdino. What's that? If a shevet acted based on the instructions of its own tribal bezdin. So what's the halacha? Also shevet chayiv. Hushar kol shvatim p'turin. So we'll say what? That shevet is chayiv, but all the other shvatim are pater. U'baharaz bezdin agadol afilu shar shvatim chayovim. We'll say, but if the one shevet acted based on the instruction of the bezdin agadol, then what? Even the other shvatim will be chayiv shmamina. So we'll say, halach l'ma'is according to Rabbi Huda. But so we just learned 2 interesting things, by the way. So first of all, according to Rabbi Huda, it appears that there could be a chiyuv for a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur, according to Rabbi Huda, even when it's based on the psak din of the high court of that shevet. But according to Rabbi Huda, if the shevet is following the erroneous instruction of its own high court, then that shevet will bring a par ha'elam davar min hatzibur, but what? Not the other shvatim. But if one shevet is acting on the instructions of the Beis Din Agadol, then, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that shevet brings a par, and what? All of the other shvatim are activated as well. So we'll say, so it turns out that in Rabbi Yehuda's model, indeed, when you have any time a shevet acts erroneously based on the instruction of the Sanhedrin Agadol, all of the shvatim end up bringing a par helam davar min hatzibur. Incredible. Rav Ashi says the truth is this is supported by our Mishnah as well. Diktani va'asa also shevet al pihem. Right, the pasuk says that particular shevet acted based on their word. Also a shevet chayiv ushar shala kol hashvatim paturin. You're telling me then that it's only that one shevet who's chayiv, but the other shvatim are patur. If that's the case, lama li lemisnu ushar shvatim paturin. The Mishnah didn't need to say the other shvatim are patur. Hatana osa shevet chayiv. Since the Mishnah says that shevet is chayiv, I would have understood that what? The chayvan the tana osa shevet chayiv memeli yedano shar shvatim paturin. We'll say, once the Mishnah says that shevet is chayiv, by definition of the other shvatim are patur, elahak mashmalon, the behoraz bezdino the shar shvatim paturin. Ava behoraz bezdin agadol afilu shar shvatim chayovin shmamina. Rather, we can even take from the Mishnah that it's only in the case, ultimately again, where shevet is following the instruction of its own bezdin, that shevet will be chayiv, the other shvatim will be paturin. But if a particular shevet is following the erroneous ruling of the Sanhedrin Agadol, then once that shevet has to bring a par helam davar min hatzibur, then what? The other shvatim must do so as well. An incredible sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. Both say, so again, whether or not you pass like that halacha l'maisa remains to be seen. But at least now we understand that Shitas Rabbi Yehuda is Rabbi saying that first of all, a number of novelties. Number one, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, that even if one shevet follows the erroneous ruling of Beis Din, of the Sanhedrin, it has to bring a par helam davar min hatzibur. Why? Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, each shevet is called a kal. Not only that, but once one shevet has to bring the par helam davar min hatzibur, then what? Every shevet has to bring. The only exception to that rule is if it's not a ruling of the Sanhedrin Agadol, but it's a ruling of the high court of that shevet. In that case, if the shevet is following the ruling of its own high court, then what? Then that shevet has to bring a karban. The other shvatim do not. A very strong message about collective responsibility. Absolutely. Arvos ibailu shevet echad shasavaraz beis din agadol. So let's listen to this. What happens if you have a shevet echad, one shevet shasavaraz beis din agadol? It will say follow the psak halacha of the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin handed down an erroneous ruling. You have one shevet who follows it. So the Rabbi Shimon mi ma'isiolo. So now we're transitioning from Rabbi Yehuda to Rabbi Shimon. We'll say, remember again, what was Shitas Rabbi Shimon? Shitas Rabbi Shimon was, Rabbi Shimon holds, he builds on Rabbi Yehuda. He says, yes, that each shevet is called its own kal. Each shevet must go ahead and bring its own parallel davar min hatzibur. And furthermore, again, when one brings, or I should say, when the majority brings, they all bring. He also adds in that the Beis Din also brings its own par. So as Rabbi Yehuda had 12 as a maximum, Rabbi Shimon has 13 as a maximum. So the Shilas will say as follows. What happens if one shevet acted on the psak of the Sanhedrin Agadol, according to Rabbi Shimon, mi maisi olo. So we'll say, so ultimately again, what happens in that case? Mi maisi olo. So we'll say, what's the level of liability in that particular case? So the Gemara says as follows, Tashma, mahin mebin, what do they bring? Par echad. Bring one par. Rabbi Shimon omer shnei parim. Rabbi Shimon says 2 parim. But my asking, Rabbi says, so what's the case? What's the Bryce's case? Ilema shechatu shiva. If you want to say that it's a case of where 7 of the shvatim sinned, shnei parim. What do you mean 2 parim? Shmona parim. So we'll say if 7 shvatim sinned, according to Rabbi Shimon, then what? You would have 8. 7 for the shvatim who sinned, and 1 for the Sanhedrin. Ela dechata shevet echad. Rather, you have to say it's a case where what? 1 of the shvatim sinned. Ubemai. We'll say, what's the case? Ilema boras beis dino. If you want to say the shevet sinned based on the psak din of its own beis din, Rabbi Shimon Leslie. We'll say Rabbi Shimon does not hold that there's any liability where a tribe, where a shevet follows its own beis din. The only time Rabbi Shimon says his liability is when it follows Sanhedrin Agadol. Ela boras beis din Agadol. Rather, it's the ras beis din Agadol Sanhedrin. V'tizbera Tanakama money. We'll say who is the Tanakama? Rabbi Meir ha-rubabayir. Well, say if it's Rabbi Meir holds, you only bring a param dav minat tzibur, either when there's a numerical or tribal rove. So, Rabbi Yehuda, shar shatan nami meister. Well, say if it's Rabbi Yehuda holds that once, even one shevet brings, then what? Then the rest have to bring as well. Elohaman Rabbi Shimon al-Lazar. Well, say rather, again, it must reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon al-Lazar, as you taught above. Tashma. V'cham the chacham say, li'olam eno chayev ela al horaz beis agadol. Chacham say that the only time you bring a parallel davin at tzibur is when halacha l'maisa. Again, they're following a psak halacha of the Sanhedrin Agadol. Man chacham, we'll say who are the chachamim? Ilim Rabbi Meir. If you want to say it's Rabbi Meir, rubabai. Rabbi Meir holds that you either need a tribal or numerical majority. Elav Rabbi Shimon he. Rather, you have to say that it is Rabbi Shimon. To which the Gemara says, ultimately again, Shema Mina. Indeed, see that this is correct. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Shevet Echad Ikri Kal Minale. Both listen to this. So now both say the common denominator between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda is that they see. Both say the difference is Rabbi Yehuda. So we saw the differences already. But what they both agree on is as follows: that even one shevet is called a kal. Even one shevet is called essentially Klal Yisrael. It's called an assembly. Where do they get that from? To which the Gemara says something amazing. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon, Shevet Echad Ikri Kal Minalu. Amri Tichsiv, Vayamod Yoshafat Bekal Yehuda, V'Yushalayim, Nocha Chatzar Hashem, Notzer Chatzar Beis Hashem Achadasha. Because the pasuk said that Yoshafat stood Bekal Yehuda V'Yerushalayim. He stood in front of the assembly of Yehuda, the Kal Yehud in Yerushalayim, opposite the Beis Hashem Achadasha. Literally again, the new house of God. What does that mean? My Chadasha. Amar Rabbi Yochanan shechidshu dvarim. But say it means that this was the place where they were mechadish, right? They made a chiddush. But say what was the chiddush? Va'amru tevul yom al yikanis b'machana leviyah. But it happens to see that under Yehoshaphat they went ahead and they made a brand new ruling, which was what? That a tevul yom, we'll say a tevul yom is someone who went to the mikvah that day, but still requires herav shemesh, still requires the sunset in order to become tahor. So they passed in that a tevul yom can't enter into machana leviyah. So we'll say, but what's the point over here? The point over here is you see that Yehoshaphat is standing in front of seemingly one tribe, which is Yehuda. And what does it call Yehuda? What does it call Yehuda? A kal. So the Gemara suggests, you see from that Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda learn out from here that even one shevet is called a kal. To which the Gemara says, Maskif l'Ravacha bar Yaakov mimai dilma sheni Yerushalayim. Maybe Yerushalayim is different. I'll tell you why. Dahavidnami binyamin. Because Rabbi say, remember again, here's what's interesting about Yerushalayim. In all the other areas of Eretz Yisrael, they were predominantly occupied by one tribe. Yerushalayim was unique about is that Yerushalayim was actually occupied by 2 tribes. Shouldn't use occupied. Occupied is the wrong word for Eretz Yisrael, right? That inhabited, right? Yerushalayim was inhabited by 2 tribes, right? By Yehuda and Binyamin. So maybe the reason why the Navi uses the Lashon Kal over here is because in Yerushalayim there were 2 tribes. But Einachinami, that is not necessarily a raya that one tribe constitutes that one tribe constitutes a kal. To which the Gemara says, you're right, we can bring another raya. D'chsiv vayomer Eli, hineni mafracha v'rbisicha unisaticha lekahal amim. Pasek Baruch who says to Yaakov Avinu, I will make you fruitful, I will multiply you, and I will make you to kahal amim. Now this was said to Yaakov Avinu right before when? Man is yalid le'ahishait. I will say, who was born in that moment? Binyamin. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says this to Yaakov Avinu right after the birth of one of the tribes, Binyamin. So you see from here that what? That even the birth of one tribe is, or even one tribe is called Kal. Shmamina, Hachikam Rachmana. This is what the Torah is saying. Misyalid l'cha hashta Kal Achrina. Ultimately, again, who's going to be born to you right now? Another Kal. So you see from here, ultimately, that's what Rabbi was saying, that even one Shevet is called a Kal. Maybe perhaps this is what Cheshvan was telling Yaakov Avinu. Maybe God was saying something different. You're about to give birth to Binyamin. Now you're going to have 12 tribes. 12 tribes is called a Kal. To which the Gemara says, it doesn't make sense. Why does that make any sense? 12 tribes are called the Kal, 11 tribes are not called the Kal. Rather, the Gemara says, no, it must be, you see from here, that even one tribe is called the Kal. So we'll say the Gemara ends, we're going to stop over here for today, but the Gemara ultimately, you can still have the coffee, Nechemia. The coffee is still yours. Right, so you see over here, that's what? That Lemaisa, again, even one tribe is called the Kal. So the Gemara Bozeh is bringing two different potential sources. Either ultimately, again, from Binyamin, the fact that the birth of Binyamin is called the birth of a Kahal, or ultimately, again, from Yehoshaphat, that Yehoshaphat is standing, and when he addresses Shevet Yehuda, that is called Kahal Yehuda. Alright, so we'll stop over here. Meretz Hashem, we'll pick up here tomorrow. I'll send out the schedule for tomorrow and Shabbos. Both times the daf will be in Meretz Hashem in the afternoon. We'll send it out later. Good Yom Tov and a good night.